It was a slow afternoon at the upscale restaurant The Ember's Tone, nestled in the heart of a bustling city. The sun was barely setting, casting a warm glow through the windows, and the sound of quiet chatter filled the air. Among the patrons was an older gentleman sitting at the bar, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of a weathered baseball cap. His presence seemed almost unassuming, nothing about him stood out, other than the rugged air he carried with him. The server behind the bar, a young man in his mid-20s named Greg, was busy preparing drinks for other customers when he caught sight of the man ordering a whiskey neat. Could be just some old guy enjoying his evening, Greg thought, wiping down the counter. But Greg's casual observation quickly turned into something more. When he handed the drink to the older man, he couldn't help but make a joke. "You know, you look like Clint Eastwood," Greg chuckled, trying to break the ice. The man didn't respond, just sipped his drink slowly, his eyes fixed on the glass. But Greg, thinking nothing more of it, returned to his work. His joke, however, was not received in the way he expected. "Yeah, I've been told that before," the older man muttered, not making any effort to explain further. Greg, assuming he was just a fan, decided to take things up a notch. Little did he know, the man sitting at the bar was actually Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and filmmaker. The very Clint Eastwood who had shaped Hollywood with his roles and direction. But Greg, in his youthful arrogance, didn't think twice about the resemblance. After all, Clint Eastwood was an icon from an older era, and he couldn't possibly imagine the real man would be in his restaurant, blending in like any other customer. And so, Greg's demeanor grew more casual. What happened next would change his night, and the reputation of the restaurant, forever. Greg continued to serve the rest of the evening with his usual banter, occasionally casting glances at the old man who seemed completely at ease. The bar was filling up, the atmosphere growing more lively. But Greg had a specific role in his mind: he needed to keep the customers entertained. It was part of his charm, or so he thought. "You know," Greg said as he wiped a glass with a cloth, "a lot of people mistake me for some famous actor. Maybe I've got a bit of the Eastwood vibe, don't you think?" He chuckled at his own attempt at humor, but the older man, who, as it turns out, had been Clint Eastwood this whole time, didn't crack a smile. Instead, he took another sip from his drink, his face still stone-cold serious. Greg, now emboldened by the few drinks he'd served himself in between rounds, decided to press on. "Look, old man, I don't know what your deal is, but if you think you're Clint Eastwood or something, that's fine. But I don't take kindly to old-timers trying to act like they're some big shot, especially in a place like this," Greg said, rolling his eyes, his voice growing sharper. The air in the restaurant shifted. A couple of nearby patrons, overhearing Greg's insolent remarks, exchanged uneasy glances. They could feel the tension building, but none of them dared to speak up. The man at the bar, still silent, set his glass down and slowly turned to face Greg. There was something unsettling about his calm demeanor, something that made the young server hesitate for just a moment. But Greg, too proud and a little drunk on his own bravado, simply scoffed. "Seriously, dude, you're not fooling anyone. If you're Clint Eastwood, then I'm a Hollywood producer." That's when Clint Eastwood, without a word, stood up from his stool and walked toward the manager's office. The restaurant manager, a tall woman named Allison, was finishing up a meeting when she saw Clint Eastwood walk into her office. The old man's presence immediately caught her off guard. She knew that face anywhere, one of the most iconic faces in the history of film. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "Yes," Clint Eastwood replied in his gravelly voice. "I think you need to have a word with your employee." His voice was calm, but there was a hint of frustration in it that Allison couldn't ignore. Allison blinked, momentarily stunned. What happened?" "He's got some kind of problem with me. I'm Clint Eastwood, and your server thinks I'm some old guy trying to act like a big shot," Clint said, his tone dry, like he had dealt with this sort of thing before. It took Allison a moment to process the information, her mind racing to understand what was going on. She glanced at the monitor, which showed the bustling dining room, and then back at Clint. That can't be right, she muttered, still unsure of what to do. But the look on Clint's face was not one of the playful man the public saw in his films. It was a man who had been wronged in his own quiet, reserved way, a man who had earned every ounce of respect he was due. Greg, oblivious to the gravity of his actions, was still bustling behind the bar when Allison stormed back into the main area. She was visibly upset, and there was a certain energy in the air that Greg couldn't quite place. "Greg!" Allison barked, her voice sharp. "I need to speak with you right now." Greg, rolling his eyes, wiped his hands on his apron before turning toward her. "What's up?" "I've got a lot of work to do." Allison grabbed him by the arm and dragged him into the back room, where the tension of the moment would unfold. "Do you know who you just insulted?" she asked, her voice cold now. Greg, still confident and a little smug, shook his head. "I don't care." "Some old guy who thinks he's Clint Eastwood." Before he could finish his sentence, Clint Eastwood himself appeared in the doorway, his presence suddenly undeniable. Greg's eyes widened. His smug expression faltered as the reality of the situation settled in. You're Clint Eastwood." Greg stammered, his face turning pale. Clint simply nodded, the silence hanging heavy in the air. His next words were as quiet as they were cutting. "You know, kid, sometimes the legends are sitting right under your nose. But you don't recognize them until it's too late." The weight of the realization hit Greg all at once. The following days were full of whispers around the restaurant. Greg had been suspended for a week, with Allison and the other staff members giving him a well-deserved lecture about respect. As for Clint Eastwood, he didn't cause a scene. Instead, he walked away with grace, just as he had always done. Greg, on the other hand, would never forget the lesson that day: never judge a book by its cover, and never underestimate the power of humility. The restaurant's reputation took a slight hit from the incident, but the staff knew this would blow over. It was the kind of place that attracted its fair share of eccentric characters, but nobody had ever witnessed something quite like what had happened with Clint Eastwood. The legend had remained calm, but the ripple effect would linger for much longer than anyone anticipated. Greg, however, was a different story. He returned from his suspension, walking into the kitchen with his head hung low. Allison didn't need to say anything, she simply looked at him with a cold stare, and he knew exactly what that look meant. He had embarrassed the entire team, and for what? A quick joke at the expense of one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. That evening, Greg took his usual spot behind the bar, but something had changed. He was no longer the cocky young server who thought he could make light of every situation. The humiliation of realizing who he had insulted, and the silent judgment he received from his colleagues, weighed heavily on him. Greg had always taken pride in his wit, but after the encounter with Eastwood, he realized the importance of knowing when to keep his mouth shut. It wasn't just about saving face anymore, it was about earning respect. The reputation of the restaurant, and his own, depended on it. A week later, the restaurant was bustling again, with its usual clientele. Allison noticed Greg, for the first time, standing by the bar and simply serving drinks without cracking any jokes. He greeted customers with a calm demeanor, his arrogance nowhere to be found. The phone rang, and Allison picked it up. It was the manager of a new VIP client, a famous director, who would be coming in for dinner. As she finished the call, she glanced at Greg, wondering how he'd handle this new challenge. Would he fall back into his old ways, or had the incident with Clint Eastwood truly changed him? That night, as the new guests arrived, Allison watched Greg's face light up when he recognized the VIP party. But rather than approach them with his usual bravado, he stood back, waited, and greeted them with a simple, "Good evening," instead of trying to impress them with witty banter. The rest of the night passed without incident, but as the guests left, the director, who had overheard the story about Greg's misstep with Clint Eastwood, pulled Allison aside. "You know, I've heard about that story," the director said, a slight grin playing at his lips. You guys handled it well, but I think there's a lesson here for your staff. Sometimes, it's not about what you say. It's about knowing your place and knowing when to listen. Allison nodded, watching Greg, who now seemed more humble, more grounded. Maybe, just maybe, Clint Eastwood had taught him a lesson he would never forget. As the director left, he turned to Greg and added, "It takes a lot of courage to apologize and learn from your mistakes. Keep that in mind." Greg, for the first time in weeks, genuinely smiled and nodded, grateful for the advice, even if it had taken the confrontation with one of Hollywood's legends to get there. The weeks passed, and Greg's shift in attitude didn't go unnoticed. Allison saw a marked change in him, not only in his behavior toward customers but also in how he interacted with his fellow staff. He became quieter, more thoughtful, and noticeably more respectful. He no longer made offhand jokes, but instead, took time to truly connect with the patrons. One afternoon, when the restaurant was still quiet before the evening rush, Greg sat at the bar with a cup of coffee. His mind wandered back to that day with Clint Eastwood. Every time he thought about it, the weight of the encounter felt even heavier. He had been so certain that he knew everything, so sure that his jokes and humor would win over anyone, regardless of who they were. But that day, he had learned the hardest lesson: humility. Greg had seen a lot of customers come and go. Some were famous faces that could walk right through the door without anyone noticing, and others were just looking for a good meal and a quiet place to unwind. But after Clint Eastwood had left that day, he realized something. The famous faces weren't the ones who always mattered the most. It was about the stories that people carried with them, the histories behind the names. It was a quiet afternoon when another figure entered the Ember's tone. Greg didn't recognize the man at first. The man was older, in his mid-50s perhaps, with salt and pepper hair and a confident stride. He walked in with purpose, his suit impeccably tailored, his presence commanding attention. At first glance, he seemed like just another wealthy businessman, but something about him felt different. Allison glanced over at Greg, who was still deep in thought, and nudged him with a knowing look. "Hey, Greg," she said softly. "You see that guy? That's Tom Ward, the director of one of the largest film studios in Hollywood. I heard he's in town looking for fresh talent for a new project." Greg froze. His heart skipped a beat. He had heard of Tom Ward, of course. Who hadn't? The director was known for making major blockbusters, the kind of films that had the entire industry talking for months. "Don't make a scene," Allison continued. "He's here for dinner, but if you're lucky, you might be able to have a word with him." Greg wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't the same brash young server he had been before, but the thought of having a chance to speak with someone like Tom Ward sent a nervous excitement through him. This was a different opportunity, one he couldn't afford to mess up. He walked over to the table where Tom Ward was seated, his hands a little shaky. He had learned from his mistakes, and now, more than ever, he understood the importance of making a good impression. As he approached the table, he noticed how calm and composed the director was, how he seemed so naturally at ease, despite his fame. "Good evening, Mr. Ward," Greg greeted, keeping his voice steady but polite. "My name is Greg. I'll be your server tonight." Tom Ward looked up from his menu, his eyes meeting Greg's. There was a moment of silence as he studied Greg's face, and Greg couldn't help but feel a bit self-conscious. But then Tom smiled, a warm and genuine smile that made Greg relax just a little. "Nice to meet you, Greg," Tom said with a deep voice. "I've heard good things about this place. It's got a reputation for being one of the best around." Greg nodded, feeling the pressure mounting. "We try our best," he said. "Can I get you something to start with?" Tom Ward ordered a drink, and Greg quickly prepared it, trying to maintain his composure. As he brought the drink to the table, he noticed something about the director's demeanor. He wasn't here for a typical meal. There was something more at play, something deeper than just a simple dinner. "I've been looking for new faces for my upcoming project," Tom said casually, as if they were simply chatting. "I'm always on the lookout for people with character." Greg blinked, unsure if he had heard him correctly. "Character?" Tom nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "The thing is, I don't need just any actor or actress. I need someone who can bring something real to the screen. It's hard to explain, but you'll know it when you see it." Greg was still processing this when Allison came over, sensing the tension in the air. She smiled warmly at Tom and quickly took over the conversation, giving Greg a moment to gather his thoughts. The rest of the night passed, but Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had just happened. He had been standing there, just doing his job, and yet, the chance to speak with Tom Ward had somehow fallen into his lap. But what did it mean? Was he ready for an opportunity like that? As the night wound down and the restaurant emptied, Greg couldn't help but think back to Clint Eastwood, to the lessons learned from that moment. Maybe this, too, was an opportunity for him to prove that he had grown. He wasn't the arrogant kid he once was. He was ready, more than ever, to take whatever came his way. Weeks passed since the evening with Tom Ward, and Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. The days felt longer, more meaningful, and each time he stepped behind the bar, he carried with him the weight of his earlier lessons. But the true test had yet to come. He didn't expect it to be so soon. It was a chilly Thursday evening, and the restaurant was quieter than usual. The kind of night when staff could take a breath and appreciate the peace. Greg stood behind the bar, wiping down glasses, lost in thought. He still couldn't believe that he'd actually had a conversation with Tom Ward. He wasn't sure if it was a sign or just a fluke, but either way, it had lit a fire inside him. Then, without warning, the door to the restaurant swung open, and in walked Clint Eastwood. The room fell silent as he stepped inside, his presence undeniable. Greg's heart raced. The moment he laid eyes on Clint, a wave of embarrassment and awe washed over him. It had been months since their first encounter, but he knew this moment would be different. Clint Eastwood, looking as timeless as ever, walked up to the bar. This time, Greg wasn't about to make the same mistake. The humiliation from their first meeting still lingered, but he had grown. The young server who had once cracked jokes at Clint's expense was no longer there. In his place was someone who understood the power of humility. Greg took a deep breath and approached him. "Good evening, Mr. Eastwood," Greg said, his voice calm and steady, his eyes meeting Clint's without flinching. "I'll be your server tonight." Clint looked up at him, the same unreadable expression on his face. For a moment, it felt as if time had slowed down. The past and present collided. Greg remembered that first interaction, the jokes, the disrespect, and how far he had come since then. "I remember you," Clint said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "You've changed. I can tell." Greg nodded, his throat tightening slightly. "I've learned a lot since then. I won't make the same mistake twice." Clint studied him for a moment longer, then nodded in approval. "Good," he said simply. "People don't forget how you treat them. Remember that." Greg stood there, silent for a moment, absorbing his words. The past months of learning, the growth, the lessons from Clint Eastwood himself, they all culminated in this very moment. Greg had learned that respect wasn't something to be earned through bravado or flashy remarks. It came from understanding people, listening, and recognizing the worth in everyone. After a brief exchange, Clint Eastwood ordered his drink, and Greg prepared it with care, pouring it slowly, making sure each step was deliberate. It wasn't just about the drink, it was about the moment. He wasn't just serving an icon, he was honoring the lessons he had learned. As Clint sipped his drink, Greg couldn't help but smile to himself. This was the kind of life he wanted to live, one that wasn't defined by arrogance or fame but by kindness, humility, and respect for others. He had walked through the fire of his own mistakes, and now, he was a different person. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Eastwood," Greg said, his voice steady. Clint gave a small nod and a faint smile, as if to acknowledge that Greg had finally passed the test. As Clint left the restaurant that night, the patrons didn't recognize him as the legend he was, they just saw him as another customer, quietly enjoying his evening. And Greg, for the first time, realized that was the way it was supposed to be. Some lessons took time to learn. But the ones that truly mattered stayed with you forever.